Boys don't cry. These things have been reinforced from as soon as men could talk, as soon as they learnt the words.
The men who sign up to the most extreme forms of, traditional views of masculinity are often the ones that in today's world are facing some of the biggest challenges of mental health.
The whole issue about men crying or not crying is a very nice indication of the way in which society expects different things of men and women. And as we know, or as I know as a neuroscientist, this expectation will change how their brains function, how their brains develop, and become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
The most powerful thing that's wrong with it is that it doesn't work for men themselves. If they realise that there are constraints on them that if they could escape from, they would have happier, more fulfilled lives.
When 12 men are killing themselves every day in the UK, and when the majority of our prisons are filled with men, when the majority of the homeless on our streets are men, you've got to say that this man's world, this idea of a man's world, it's not working. It's not working.
My entire adult life, in the sense of, if I go back to being, say, 13, 14, maybe the last time that I cried, it was then 20 years between ever crying again. So I was 34, well into my adult life, when I cried for the first time as a man, I suppose.
During primitive times, men and women, you had the hunter-gatherer thing. Men hunted and women gathered things, and between them I think that the relationship was fairly equal.
Patriarchy is innate to societies that are based on class. And the reason why patriarchy arose was once you had the agricultural revolution in the Neolithic in the Middle East, some people were able to amass more property than other people. So you had the concept of private property emerging. And if you're a man and you've got private property and you're very impressed with yourself that you've got private property, you want to pass that on to your children, well, how do you know who your children are? The only way you can know who are your children is if you control women. So women start becoming property in the same way that lots of sheep or a big granary full of grain is property. And that's the origins of women's oppression.
In Western society, maybe 200 years ago, the idea grew that men would be out there working as part of, in the factories, in the fields, and women increasingly were expected to stay at home, looking after the children. There was this stronger division of roles. So the idea grew that not only should men do that, but they were good at that. That's what masculinity was all about. And that for women, you stay at home. So there were things men were good at and things men weren't good at and weren't meant to do. You weren't meant to be looking after small children. And it's just as well because you weren't meant to be any good at it. So you leave that to women. And men internalised these ideas. They thought, well, there's no point me doing that because women should do it and they're the ones who are good at it. We're good at this other stuff.
It's a very patriarchal view based on stereotypes or behavioural tropes that have been established over hundreds, if not thousands of years. I think they've tried to catch up with some elements of society, but the catch-up hasn't existed, and that also a lot of those stereotypes may have remained but were enacted in different ways.
A terrific right by Purple Wave Dempsey goes.
Aggression, part of being a man, is always associated with aggressive or dominating behaviour, whether this is physical violence or loud behaviour or attempts to dominate a room or shouting. It can come out in many ways. It can also be really subtle. Some of this aggression can be in terms of control in relationships.
Men feeling the need to be domineering, feeling the need to take over.
We know this to be domestic abuse, but the ways in which it can happen are through deciding where people go for dinner. It sounds like a small thing, but if that decision is always happening with one person, and that's always the male who sees himself as dominant, then it creates a pattern in which one person has the control. And the aggression really comes out of that when being challenged, or when there's a suggestion that the man doesn't get the choice. Emotive behaviour, not being able to access one's own emotions, especially when that's around depression, anxiety, things that are considered weak in a traditionally masculine society. Those are the really difficult end of accessing emotion and can lead to serious problems around mental health and suicide and other related problems which can lead to those, which are both a cause and affect those including self-medicating with drugs and alcohol and lashing out at those around us as men.
We did a study a few years ago and recognised that young men were using only 2 or 3 emotions during a school day. And we found that quite shocking. So they were either usually happy and laughing or very angry. And there wasn't a huge amount in between. In the work that we do in schools, what we try to do is to encourage young men particularly to, as I say, use a range of their emotions, to connect with other individuals.
But the emotional side also is something that is again relates to that aggressive side, because the one emotion that men are encouraged to show is rage or anger. This idea that if something's difficult and you're a man, you can be angry, you can get angry at it and it will go away. This lack of choice, that if you feel you have to follow a traditional masculine role and you have to act in certain ways, then it vastly limits your ability to do other things.
New mothers and fathers also have ideas that they've grown up with about what boys are like and what girls are like, and because they have those expectations, they expect their children to be like that. They expect their boys to run around, to have rough and tumble, not to carry around dolls, not to push a pram around. They expect girls to do the opposite things. Boys and girls want to fulfill they want to please their parents. They grow up learning these things, doing these things. It becomes part of who they are. They get a lot of praise for being a certain way, and they get disapproval for being another way.
The classic example again is childcare. Being able to be a father who just stays at home and looks after a child, that's a beautiful thing to do, but you're encouraged to feel that that's in some way effeminate or non-masculine, that you can't be doing that. That's damaging for the adult male who wants to look after children, it's damaging for the child who needs that role model and who naturally would love their father. It's damaging for a female partner if there is an existing relationship and there are 2 parents for that child. Then there's this idea that the woman in that relationship would have to be doing this and that there isn't choice there for her.
It is important, if we're going to sort this out, to recognise that it's in everyone's interests for this to change. Just as it oppresses many women that they're expected to look after children, it equally oppresses men who want to care for their children, who believe they can do it, but aren't supported by our society and often by people around them to do that. It affects everyone. So in a way, everyone can benefit by changing these things.
Having a child is another point at which we do a lot of work. I mean, it's a great leveler having a child, because whatever you've been before that, young men can begin to look and reflect and think, what kind of a father do I want to be? How do I want my child to perceive me? How do I want my child to be perceived by other people? What kind of lessons do I want to teach to my child? And it gives you a whole different perspective on life. You know, it's why you see fathers often change so much. They are great spaces to learn about ourselves, to change as men.
So much of the time when there is actually a discussion about how these stereotypes can be negative, it's about how they can be negative towards other people, not people who aren't men, people of other genders who identify as women or otherwise. When people are finally discussing whether the stereotype of being a man is not a good thing or whether there's reason we might to change it, the discussion doesn't even include the men themselves, and that's the most crucial part.
One of the negative ideas, actually, that we teach boys and girls is that masculinity is fundamentally bad. Boys will be boys, irresponsible, violent, aggressive. What we don't do nearly enough is to recognise boys and men who do things differently, who are gentle, who are kind, who know and show that they're not that type of man.
What it means to be a man, I thought I'd go back to basics and I'd actually look up in the English dictionary what that says and have a look at some of the synonyms it gave me. What it actually said was to be a man was to be brave, to be strong, to be heroic. And by comparison, I looked up femininity and it gave me softness, gentleness, kindness. What happens if a man's taught that he's not to show any weakness. He bottles it up, he internalises it, and that's when I think the real problems are caused. That's potentially a contributing factor to all the tragic statistics that we have surrounding men and suicide.
When you look at societies where you didn't have gender oppression, it's really interesting because you can see that men aren't afraid of their feelings. And one of the ways that we can tell that these towns in Turkey that I was talking about earlier that didn't have class, one of the ways we can tell that they had equal genders is that you have men buried with lots and lots of jewellery. They're often just as often buried with lots of jewellery as the women are. And you have paintings on the walls of the houses of men playing with small children, which again you don't get. That's not kind of part of traditional masculinity. You know, traditional masculinity is all like, oh, you don't have anything to do with children until they're grown up and can go to war with you.
The only reliable difference is that baby boys' brains tend to be bigger, but that's because baby boys tend to be bigger. It's actually quite difficult to look at the structures and functions of newborn babies, but what work has been done has demonstrated that there really is very little difference, and where there are differences they are very small. And of course most of the science has been done on fairly small groups of children, so we can't necessarily generalise to the population as a whole.
Mental health is where you see the biggest issues and the biggest impact of masculinity, particularly in terms of help seeking. But also I think there's a strong case that the way that men illustrate mental distress is different from the way that women do. Men in the UK are 95% of rough sleepers, they're 90% of people in prison, they're the overwhelming majority of people who are dying from consuming too much alcohol or from drug overdoses. So what we see is that mental distress amongst men is associated with a sort of toxic combination of self-destructive behaviour and failure to ask for help. And that certainly is something that is very damaging in terms of men and their mental well-being. There is the belief that if you're a strong man, you bottle it up and you keep it silent and you don't talk to your friends about your feelings and how things might be going. And in particular, men who have these views particularly strongly are the ones who are particularly vulnerable to mental health issues.
For men as well, it becomes quite difficult to make friends as men get older. In the UK, I think I've seen something recently that men after the age of about 26 make drastically fewer friends because they're not in the social situations anymore where that would be possible, such as school or university or, you know, in a new job where everyone else is new. And a lot of this sometimes comes from potentially this fear of being seen as being gay, which is ridiculous, that you want to make friends with someone and the other man is worried. I used to work in pubs, was a barman for years, and I'm so used to it in English pubs. There's the man, the local, who just sits at the bar. He comes in after work at 5:30 and he'll drink until 9 o'clock, 9:30, go home, go to sleep, wake up, do it again. And there would be lots of these men lined up next to each other and they would barely speak to each other. Really draws down so many of these male stereotypes or this traditional masculinity into one small space and small area, which is, you know, the bar, the man alone with his drink, and that drink is the company.
It depends what you mean by intelligent. If you mean do boys, men have different skills from girls and women, again the evidence is that there's very little difference at birth between boys and girls. So the kind of cognitive skills or sensory skills that you might be able to measure are very small. There's some evidence that in some areas girl babies mature slightly quicker than boys, but again, small numbers and the differences are very small.
We know that male violence against women is a huge problem, but the majority of violence suffered by men is at the hands of other men. So that's also the most violence suffered by anyone. So men fighting each other, men trying to prove dominance is a huge problem. And physically, we are in danger of this idea that if you are seen as male, if your sex is male and other people see you in that way, there is the chance that someone will feel that you will be someone who they can fight, and therefore you are in danger.
Do you take this man to be your lawful wedded husband?
I do.
Popeye, do you take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife?
I do. I do.
I now pronounce you man and wife.
From when we're very young, we're taught by our parents what it means to be, what it is to be a boy and then be a man, and what it is to be a girl and then grow up to a woman, what these ideals are. You know, boys are given, when they're young, cars, they're given action men, they read books about superheroes, whereas girls are given their dolls to play with, they're being told stories about princesses that are constantly being saved by these heroic men.
Lois!
Superman.
You'd better get back to your office where you'll be safe. I've got some work to do.
Yes, sir. And this is the best story in years? Well, chance.
If a parent is very rigid and always controlling how their child acts, that will be damaging. If a child comes home from school one day and says sort of, my best friend is sort of Sophie, she's, great, I want to spend all my time with her, and the parents say, no, you can't be friends with a girl. Of course that's going to be damaging. The child's going to be confused, not knowing why, it's going to limit their friendship choices, and it's going to send a message that girls aren't friends. They're the opposite of that you're supposed to be a straight male and that girls are sex objects. If a parent is bringing their children up not saying that you need this to be male, but it happens to be promoting some of those values, for instance, if they're saying, let's go for a father-son fishing trip, some of the really old stereotypes, that in itself isn't damaging. The damaging part is if they're saying women aren't allowed on this, and if you fail to do this, you're not a man.
In 1673, de la Barre actually made the wonderful statement, the mind has no sex. And he eventually concluded that, having looked at all of the structures and functions which seemed to be important for high levels of achievement, he felt that there was really no differences between men and women. He felt that there was no reason why, given the right opportunities, women shouldn't be successful as men. So way back 1673, now, if people had listened to him, we could stop now. But obviously, people didn't listen, and what's been going on since then is actually trying to contradict his conclusion.
Goes back a very long time, 17th, well, probably before, but certainly 17th, 18th, 19th century, when people started looking at the brain, being able to measure the brain, draw conclusions about the size of the brain, even if they weren't very good conclusions, were based on the idea that women were inferior, and therefore the measures of the brain they were taking needed to confirm that. As you fast forward a bit to the 19th, 20th century, slightly more subtle ways of measuring what's going on in the brain, also including hormone levels, still the idea is that you're looking for differences, in ability, that women had a particular role, a particular place in society which was different from men's, and that you should explain that in terms of their biology. And very often the case was the biology is rather deficient in women, much more labile, their reproductive capacity was most important and mustn't be interfered with by dangerous things like education and independence and getting a job, etc. And science has really propped up those stereotypes, and to my dismay continues to do so in the 21st century.
Some of my scientific heroes, unfortunately, believed very strongly in women's inferiority and science's role in proving that. Darwin was one, Broca was another, a great brain scientist, but was really into the science of craniometry, where you're measuring skulls and drawing conclusions about people.
If you take the newest type of brain imaging, which allows you to look at both structure and function, in fairly large groups of people, allowing for all sorts of other variables, such as the size of the brain, it turns out that there are no structural differences between males and females, and the ones much vaunted in terms of brain connectivity actually have been demonstrated not to be true. In terms of functions, there may be some differences depending on how they're tested, but we now know that the brain is exquisitely plastic throughout life. So any differences that you're looking at may come from the experience of the owner of the brain rather than the brain itself.
Men are different from women. Of course they are. Well, actually, maybe they're not.
Recent studies have demonstrated that over 100 different characteristics, cognitive skills, personality skills, temperament differences, really are better considered on our dimension. So you can't say that all men are more rational or all women are more emotional.
The speaking element's very interesting because men are more likely to dominate conversations. They're much more likely to interrupt men and especially more likely to interrupt women during a conversation. Macho culture of sexuality, I think, is very important, and I don't just mean in terms of heterosexual, homosexual, or gay, straight sexuality, which obviously is a huge problem because men being encouraged to think that it's wrong to be gay can have a hugely crushing effect on one's psyche, one's persona, one's actions, one's behaviour. But also in terms of sexual relationships with women, if a man is heterosexual or straight, depending on how you prefer to phrase this idea that you can only sleep with a certain type of woman, or that there's someone you're supposed to be attracted to, and that also you're always supposed to be prepared for sex, that as a man you're always ready, you're always available, that you're good at sex. These pressures can be huge. Again, this idea that a man might not be up for it. Obviously there are times when you won't be ready to have sex, but you can feel as a man that that's a really bad thing, that's crushing your perceived masculinity.
From a very young age, we are taught to not talk to strange men, not accept drinks from men. You would think that all men are evil and violent the way that culture goes on, and women are taught to just make adjustments for men's inevitable violence. Men are not given those same life lessons. It's very sad to be brought up in a society and be told that you are prey for the other half of the population, who by definition are predators. And incidentally, I don't believe that. I think it's patronising to both men and women. Most men don't abuse women and children, and that means there is no biological excuse for those that do.
If you look at boys going to school, what you'll find is that boys have an idea of the way they're supposed to behave in school. They have an idea that they're supposed to be strong, they're supposed to fight everybody, take no nonsense, take no prisoners in school. We're trying to teach boys is that communication is much better than hostility in school and gets you much further. But there are other points. I mean, if you look at young men going into work, it's a similar thing. People tend to think about what people are expecting of them in these situations and perform.
The very kind of atmosphere in which we grow, in which we behave, in which we bring up our children, are taught, employed, whatever, watch television if you like, is full of stereotypes which will alter our brains right from birth. And there's good evidence that very small children are aware of stereotypes at the age of 5 or 6. And their behaviour changes according to those stereotypes, even if their abilities clearly don't match them. And we can demonstrate in adolescence, for example, that belief in particular stereotypes will change their behaviour and also change how their brains process information.
As a child, once I was a teenager, I didn't really cry as a boy, and I was never told not to cry. My dad wasn't that kind of person. But I think you just see what is out there. You're looking at films, you're looking at TV, you're looking at people and what it is to be a man or an older boy that you look up to, and nothing there you could see anyone crying. There was, that wasn't something you saw at all.
And usually what we're told is that if we don't tick certain boxes, then we're not male. And I think that that's the biggest disservice that we do, particularly to our young people.
And if you did ever see it, it would be portrayed as someone that was weak, someone that couldn't be trusted, someone that really you didn't want to be. And you would avoid at all costs being that kind of person. And so that was pushed in your head all the time, and it takes some getting over that. That takes a lot of thinking and experiences to actually work your way out of that to a point where you can try and explore that kind of, letting those kind of emotions out. Otherwise, what happens generally is it turns to anger.
While they're growing up, boys and girls are told lots of things about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a boy. A lot of those things are negative. Being aggressive, violent, not being communicative about your feelings, not even knowing about your feelings, not being any good with children, not even being safe with children, not being able to show any vulnerability, not seeking help, taking too many risks. They try to control, dominate. They don't show much gentleness. They don't cry. They expect themselves to know everything. They don't question. They don't allow themselves to be wrong, to change. All of these things, characteristics that any human being can value from, are often denied to boys and to actually those around them.
I'm a feminist, and as a feminist, I believe that men and women are equal people with equal capacity for love and compassion and sharing and caring, and that men and women are both humane humans. I believe that as a feminist, but out there in the world, society doesn't seem to believe that, and it tries to tell us lies. The culture tries to lie to us about what men and women are. So our society tells us that men are a certain way and that women are a certain way, that men have to be active and dominant, and that women generally have to be passive and compliant to male demands, that what matters about women is only how we look in terms of what men think about us, and for men what matters is power and control and money and the control of women and children as well.
In the UK, 94% of our prison population is men. What is going on here? Why is it that our prisons are dominated by men? Why is it that men are committing the most crimes? And why is it that institutions like the army are mainly dominated by men? And I think it's all because men are taught, as we know, not to have this outlet for their emotion. So sometimes it finds its way out in a negative way, which leads to obviously crime and then subsequent prison.
An almost equal number of women attempt suicide each year in the UK, but the amount of men who complete that attempt is far higher. Now that tells us something about how gender and how the way we perceive ourselves impacts this, way of dealing with a problem. Sadly, it's how so many people see it. Of course, we can't know from these people because sadly they've taken their lives why it's happened, but many people believe that the reason for this is that for men, when faced with a problem, suicide is not a cry for help or something to say, please take this seriously, I'm in trouble. It's a response to a problem that says, I have no answers. There can be no answers. No one can help me. This is my only solution. And I think that stems from building up and up and up this picture of what it is to be a man, and really having that as being an integral part of your life, that you're strong, that you succeed, that you don't have problems, that you don't ask for help. If you act in these ways, you will get things, you'll provide for people. And if you build that, this constantly successful, this impenetrable, almost perfect version of a person up to be who you feel you are, inevitably the crash is going to be all that more significant when it happens. And then you find yourself in a situation when you have to deal with this, but what's getting in the way? Traditional masculinity telling you can't ask for help, that it's weak to ask for help, or to admit that you've got emotional problems.
It's over 4,500 men commit suicide every year in the UK. That's 3 to 4 as many male suicides as there are female suicides. you know, a real contributing factor to that is the pressure that men feel to live up to these unrealistic expectations or ideals that we have of manhood. It's even in our everyday rhetoric. We're told to man up, or we're told to grow some balls. You know, it's constantly pressure is put on men to be this strong figure. And we do live in a man's world, there's no denying it.
In the area of suicide, that men are less good at asking for help than women are. In the other areas, a lot of it comes down to men's lifestyles. Historically, men smoked more than women. Men still drink much more than women. And actually, men are slightly more likely to be overweight or obese. That leads to problems, for example, with diabetes, where men are more likely to have diabetes than women. And certainly amongst middle-aged men, less likely to know that they have.
Wonderful. Our society expects boys to be a certain way. There's a long list of these characteristics that they're meant to fulfill, but not all boys are like that. They're struggling to achieve something that doesn't come naturally to them, and other characteristics that society labels as feminine, they suppress, or they don't realise they have. They end up not fulfilling their potential because they focus on these particular characteristics. Other stuff that they could, other ways they could fulfil themselves get lost. And that's lost to themselves and lost to others as well.
In that period, I'd been to things like funerals and been around people crying and in situations where people were very emotional, happy weddings, that kind of thing, and never really getting to that sort of level of emotion where I might cry. I've kind of worked on it and thought I should.
We're not allowing people to move away from the core gender roles. There's still enormous pressure to conform on that. So we allow people to expand their role. So we now say to men, you are allowed to be a caring dad, you are allowed to be nurturing, but it's always on top of being a provider, on top of being competitive and successful in the workplace. We do similar things for women. We say you are allowed to move beyond being nurturing and caring to have a successful career, but there's enormous stigma against women who are not nurturing and caring, and there's enormous stigma against men who are not providing.
Competition is an incredibly wasteful thing, which is why we have wars to get rid of the surplus that is produced. In humanitarian terms, it's dangerous, it kills people, and in family terms, men who feel they're competing often take out their concerns against their family, hence violence against the family. These things would stop as we move towards a more collaborative approach of working, and I think this is the way of the future.
When you forget all the other intrinsic values that fathers have, particularly, we'll talk about fathers and husbands have, and just talk about finance, then that pits one man against another in terms of how much they earn. Nothing else, just how much they earn. Not the content of the character, just how much money they earn. And that puts huge amounts of pressure on each male to be earning as much as possible. That can have a real negative effect. There can be huge amounts of pressure to work harder, stay at work longer, and make more money.
At the time of the worst period of the economic crisis, the suicide, there was an annual report on suicide that said as a result of all of this, there were 800 extra male suicides and 150 female suicides. What that tends to suggest is that it is this provider role that we can't let go of, and that has all kinds of knock-on effects, because one of the things it leads to is this extreme competitiveness, and one of the things that's striking about male ill health is partly it's driven by the fact that there is a bigger difference between the richest and the poorest men than there is between the richest and poorest women. I think there's a difference of 9 years in life expectancy between the top 10% and bottom 10% of deprivation for men, and it's, I think, 7 years for women.
The very, very basics that their children are expecting sometimes is very, very hard to provide. If you have a situation where they are looking to the ideals of more wealthy families, they will never ever be able to compete. They will never ever find a comfortable space, and they will always feel as though they're less than. If that attitude spreads throughout their entire family, then they're seen as we have a concept of waste men and guys that are losers because they don't earn enough money.
It's said that they only need to work 1 hour a day to produce what we really need. You would then have an issue about breaking down the division between work and other useful things. We would encourage people to use their creativity to go to new heights where, in fact, everyone could be on the level of a Leonardo, a Van Gogh, or a Frida Kahlo in creativity, and people would go further. Remember, we only use about 10% of our brain most of the time.
One of the figures we often quote is that the difference between male and female attendance at the general practitioner in the UK tends to disappear as soon as men retire.
If you look at the research, what we've seen is that, for instance, positive parenting on the part of a father can have huge benefits to a child emotionally, physically, psychologically. What happens is we negate those by the dad just thinking that if they're not bringing in enough money, then they're not a father. They're not bringing in enough money, they're not a husband. If they're not bringing in enough money, then they're not a provider.
Patriarchy existed before capitalism, but it has been very useful to maintain capitalism, particularly in the later phases of the consumer capitalist, where everything is sold, including women's bodies, the look of women. Right from a very early age, if you listen to the cartoons on a Saturday morning for children, you will see sexism there for 2- and 3-year-olds in the voices that are used for cartoons for boys and girls.
Patriarchy under feudalism looks different from patriarchy under capitalism. As capitalism changes, women's oppression will change as well. But while we're oppressed by the capitalists, it's still in their interests to divide us along sex lines, divide us on race lines, divide us according to our sexuality, all these things. It benefits the capitalists. So it's not going to go away on its own. We have to overthrow it, and we do that by overthrowing the exploitation. Not men against women, but all of us against the ruling class.
One of the things which I think has become really marked in the 21st century is this whole issue of pink for girls and blue for boys. Physiologically speaking, there's no difference between the colour vision system in the male brain or the female brain, and a lot of the differences are actually about colour preferences. So people start saying, well, even girl babies prefer pink and boy babies prefer blue. Actually, that difference doesn't emerge till they're about 2 or 3 years old. And those of you in the world who ever go into a toy shop, have children, go to card shops and see the blue "it's a boy" card and or pink "it's a girl" card, will know that the world is awash with this kind of differentiation. So the development of preferences is very much, I believe, a function of the environment.
We live in a patriarchal society, not just here in the UK, but all around the world, because patriarchy is universal. What I mean by that term patriarchy, I mean male supremacy. I mean a system where all the mainstream institutions of power are overwhelmingly held in male hands. And you can tell that we live in an unequal society if you look at the levels of violence that affect women and children, particularly sexual violence and domestic abuse. We face really high and frightening levels of male violence against women, which prove that we are not living in an equal society. Where I live, here in the UK, it's estimated that there are over 80,000 rapes every year and over 400,000 sexual assaults. Every week in this country, around 2 women are murdered by a violent male partner after a history of domestic abuse. Patriarchy has put men in charge and women at the bottom. It means that women are second-class citizens just because they are born female in this society. We are held back in terms of work and pay, and the caring work that women do for children and for sick and elderly people is not recognised and not valued. When you look at situations like the Westminster Parliament, around 80% of our MPs are male. Because we live in an unequal society, I can't pretend that all men are equal. Men are discriminated against in lots of ways. They're discriminated against because of their class, their race, their sexuality, whether they have physical disabilities, for example, but they are not discriminated against because of their sex. Being male is not a source of oppression, and that is a key difference in the experiences of women and men, because for women, being female is a source of oppression. You may not notice it, But the fact that men can walk around on the streets in the evening, can walk home without looking over their shoulder, don't have to carry their keys in their hand because they think someone's going to sneak up on them and try to rape them. You don't go into meetings thinking that people are looking at your legs or how much makeup you've got on. You don't have comments about your appearance in the same way that women do. You're shown on the television and in the media as serious people, giving your opinion on things. Your voice matters more than what you look like. Women don't enjoy those benefits. Sometimes women are in business or are in good jobs, but they still face sexism within those good jobs.
All the people who are in the support positions, like PAs and things like that, are all women. And most of the bosses are men. And there aren't any men who work in the kind of the lower level support positions. So it's kind of a repeat of what happens in the household, in the sense that the women are kind of looking after the men and the men are doing the really important strategic thing. What happens when a lot of women go into a profession? That profession starts being devalued. So, for instance, teaching, when it was mostly men who taught, teaching was a very high status profession and it was quite well paid and it was very well respected. As more women went into it and it became identified with women doing it, it became less respected.
A lot of households are changing. We've definitely seen that in terms of work balance, around partners going out and doing equal amounts of work. However, we know that women still do what's effectively the second shift, that in an average week, I believe women will do about 17 hours of housework beyond their own jobs, whereas men do about 3. So clearly that balance hasn't been addressed.
Obviously that idea that the man's in charge and the woman does what she's told is breaking down, but while women can go out to work, it's still the case that women are almost always responsible for running the household. And what people say now is that new men, nice guys, they're prepared to help out with the housework, help out with the childcare, but they help out. They don't take responsibility for organising it. They wait to be asked, do the dishes, dear. Can you stay in and look after the children tonight because I've got to work late, dear. They don't see running the household, making the decisions about the household as their job. That's still the woman's job. And when the woman's working full time as well, obviously that's a huge second shift.
Even those young men who really want to escape from gender stereotypes don't always feel sympathetic towards feminism because they don't think that it's acknowledging their experiences, the way in which gender impacts on them. One of the ways forward is for everyone to feel listened to, everyone's different experiences. Young men and young women need to realise the impact that gender stereotypes have on all of them. But it's not the same. There are ways in which it's different for young men and young women and for men and women generally. If you look at the pay gap, the way in which women still earn less for doing the same work, you look at the extent to which women experience violence at the hands of men. These things are not the same for men and women. You look at the sort of expectations that are still placed on women to be responsible for childcare. To tell a story which says that feminism is good for everyone is something that everyone can sign up to. So it's not the same for everyone, but everyone can benefit.
The issue of transgender really raises the whole issue of whether or not we should be thinking in terms of 2 discrete categories of males and females, and whether or not life would be a lot easier for everybody, males and females, if we actually didn't think in those terms, we didn't think in terms of discrete categories. The transgender individual feels, and this is how they express it, that they've been put in the wrong box, that they've been brought up as a boy, they feel that they're a girl, or the other way round, and they feel that they need to change from one box to the other, and it can be a very long and very painful journey. I think actually what we need to do is challenge the idea of the box. If you didn't put people in a box at the beginning, then there wouldn't be a problem.
When my partner and I had our own children, we tried to be very overt about how good crying is for you, and we would tell them things when they were young, like crying is a medicine, and if you cry you can often feel so much better afterwards. And particularly with my son, I think that was a very powerful message.
We actually have to break it down further. We have to think, what alternatives are there to seeing gender as completely binary as one or the other, as man or woman. They're not opposing opposites. We have to instead think of what it is to be human. We all have likes and dislikes, our strengths, our weaknesses. If we're talking about hobbies and interests, for example, some people like to read, some like sport, some like current affairs, some like art, some like to dance. As far as I'm aware, there's no correlation between that and what, your gender. We really need to embrace, I think, individuality, encourage that, and try and move away from these fixed definitions of who we are, because we know from ourselves that no one person is the same. So why try and pigeonhole us and put us into a box like that?
You don't have to fit into some kind of stoic stereotype that you've seen in the media. You don't have to be someone that you've seen on MTV. You don't have to be a gangster.
Sexism is intricately linked to selling products, but within the industries that make those products are creative industries and are people who can transform this. They're fashion designers, filmmakers and so on. Actually, these people can say, no, we're not going to show sexist images. We refuse to do that, so that gender stereotyping can be challenged there, it can be challenged in the classroom, in schools.
There's a kaleidoscope of masculinity, and there are very different ways to be male. And what we try to encourage, particularly young people at school, is for young men to try different things out, to act in different ways, to use a full lexicon of their emotions.
If they realised that there are characteristics, there are ways they could be more gentle, more open to their feelings. They can show these things and still be a real man. If they could realise that, and if they surrounded themselves with other people who also realised it, who wanted them to be like that, then the world would start to change. In 50 years' time, we will look back on our society on the idea that you could say something useful about half the human race by talking about these gendered characteristics. We will look back on that time with wonder and incredulity.
The first successful revolution in history is something like 7,300 BC, where actually people in a town in Turkey overthrew a class society and had an egalitarian society in which there wasn't patriarchy for about 3,000 years. So I think the point to remember is that none of this is inevitable. It's a thing that happened in human societies, but it didn't have to happen, and it can be changed.
Other side of it is starting to change, that there's a lot more acceptance of sexuality, of being gay or not being sexually active. It doesn't have to mean asexual, but being, not always on the prowl. I definitely think there's a lot changing to do with clothing and appearance, that men don't necessarily have to be the sort of tough man who's always alpha male type person.
The first thing that men need to do is what women have done for decades, which is to get together in groups of men and do what feminists call consciousness raising. They need to address their own position within patriarchy and understand what it means to be a man within that system and how they could be a man in a positive and progressive way.
Encouraging men to look at what we describe as privilege, that is the benefits you get as a result of being born male, in terms of whether it be in obvious things like job opportunities or pay, or whether it be in people listening to you when you talk, or men being able to interrupt a conversation. And being free from the majority of sexual violence that happens in the world. These are all privileges. Even if you are a man who tries to move away from the traditional stereotype of masculinity, that nonetheless you live in a world where those privileges are imbued upon you and other people will view you in that way. Even if you feel you don't have these advantages, or you feel that you don't enact them or abuse them, you've got to realise that other people will see it in that way. And that as a man, you have the ability to help other men to not abuse those advantages and to help them to realise how they can act.
On a daily basis, men should call out other men's sexism and prejudice. That's not an easy thing to do, but I think men should question other men about sexist jokes, sexist assumptions, comments that they make about women.
Being a man or masculinity can be whatever you want it to be, as long as it doesn't cause people harm. But the complexity here is that harm can be caused in many ways. Not talking about your emotions can cause you harm. Catcalling someone, shouting nice legs at a woman in the street can cause much more harm than people realise.
Opposing women's oppression and opposing sexism, that has to be part of masculinity. That's not giving in to women or being soft or whatever. That's, any man who thinks that he's progressive and he's on the side of women, has to be, in a sense, support the goals of feminism. And it's in men's interest as well, because it's part of getting rid of exploitation.
An ideal masculinity look like? Maybe, for example, it would be gentle and strong. Men would show vulnerability and they would be courageous. Men would be independent, but they would also be dependent on others. They would also have close relationships. Reliable, but they would also be open to change. Creative, gifted and creative, but they would also be prepared to be ordinary. And above all, they would realise that they have something in common with humanity.
I have yet to see a demonstration made up of solely men outside a pornography shop or a lap dancing or strip club, for example, saying that this is not how men want to view women, that women's bodies are not for sale, that they don't view women as commodities.
We cannot tolerate male domination inside social transformation movements. There has to be equality in all social transformation movements, and that is a problem to the men who've tended to dominate. I
would like to see men in public life and the media ask, where are the women on the panels and shows and spaces that they have?
The masculinity can be anything someone wants it to be, but I feel that the individual has to make the effort to find out how they can be that person without causing harm. It's up to us to look at what we're doing and who we're being.
Younger men particularly are starting to do that. They're starting to explore more of themselves and feeling that it's okay to be the people that they want to be. And I think that's the future, really. For me, the future is men being the men that they want to be and not being shackled by the ideas of the past.
In a culture where women are subject to rape and the threat of rape, women are always on lookout for thinking, am I going to get myself into a difficult situation? If I go home with this guy, is he not going to let me say no, therefore I won't go? Whereas if you have an equal society where women don't have to be afraid of that, then they can have more open sexuality as well as men. And so probably actually, while I think many men think that feminism would deprive them of opportunities for sex, I think actually a genuinely free society, there would probably be a lot more fun sex going on.
A lot of people are ready to talk to young people about the variety of choices there are in who you are, and that they're willing to talk to young people about how you can be the person you feel comfortable being. That doesn't make you more or less of a man.
It's not about being a man and being a woman, and it's about being a human being.
Life as a whole is full of messages, mixed messages, or perhaps, unfortunately, not mixed messages, which actually are changing the ways our brains work, the way our brains develop and become a sort of vicious circle, generally vicious and not virtuous, which can change people's attitudes to themselves, whether or not they reach their potential, what they can contribute to society, how they treat each other, which is also, I think, very important.
I trained for London Marathon in 2006, which was an exhaustive thing, and the actual day was almost like me and my wife were never going to finish it. And we crossed the line together, and like a waterfall, seriously, cried my eyes out. Weirdly, the whole moment was spoilt as well, by the way, because here I am, first time in 20 odd years I'm crying. And a man grabs me and says, have you got a pen? Have you got a pen? I need to write my time down. And I'm like, I'm having a moment here, you know. So that was kind of my first time. And ever since then, I can cry in films now, which is kind of weird.
A reinvention of being a man would probably involve a lot more conversation and discussion, and less of this strong silent type being good, but more someone who wants to learn from others and is looking to listen more than he is to preach. Someone who wants to treat people of all genders in a way that is caring and attentive, and that all those people are treated as important people, not for being men, women, trans, intersex, whoever they may be. It's someone who doesn't value others more importantly for who they were born to be. That of course intersects with issues around race, sexuality, ability. It's a very different world from the one we live in now.